My name is Aria Mooncrest. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known for being composed, dependable, and, if I'm being honest, easy to overlook. I work in a role that rewards consistency more than visibility, the kind of person people trust with responsibilities, but rarely stop to truly see. Friends used to describe me as steady, low maintenance, or strong in a quiet way. None of those are insults, but none of them tells the whole story either. I've learned that when you move through the world without demanding attention, people often mistake your silence for simplicity. They assume you don't notice things, that you don't feel the pauses, the omissions, the moments where a choice could have been made, but wasn't. I noticed all of it. I just didn't narrate it out loud. This story isn't about revenge, exposure, or winning in some dramatic sense. It's about recognition, first internal, then external. It's about what happens when you realize that being present is not the same as being chosen. For a long time, I lived inside a marriage that looked intact from the outside. We shared routines, shared space, shared history, but somewhere along the way, I had to confront a truth that felt too quiet to name. I was married to someone who never chose me. What follows is not a spiral of accusations. There are no villains here pacing back and forth, no explosive confrontations, no sudden twists of fate. This is a slow story, a human one. It's about accumulation, the weight of small moments, repeated patterns, and the strange loneliness of being valued for your presence while your commitment is taken for granted. As I would later understand it, presence existed without commitment. In this narrative, you'll hear about how subtle dismissals can become normalized, how love can be replaced by expectation, and how silence, when chosen consciously, can become a form of clarity rather than surrender. You'll also hear about restraint, about choosing not to burn bridges, but to simply stop standing on them alone. I'm sharing this not to ask for sympathy and not to instruct anyone on what they should do in their own relationships. I'm sharing it because stories like this are often lived quietly, then buried under phrases like, "it just didn't work out." And I think there's value in slowing down and telling the truth carefully, without exaggeration, without cruelty. If you stay with me, this will take time. It's meant to. This is a 60 to 90-minute journey because understanding doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in layers, just like the realization that something you called love had slowly stopped choosing you back. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without pressure. Have you ever been in a place where you showed up every day, yet still wondered if anyone would choose you if you stopped? For a long time, I was easy to describe, at least on the surface. I was the dependable one. The one who remembered schedules without reminders, who anticipated needs before they were spoken, who filled the quiet gaps so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. In rooms full of stronger personalities, I became the stabilizer. In relationships, I became the constant. To my spouse, I was solid. That was the word they used most often. Solid like furniture you trust not to collapse. Solid like a background wall, supportive, necessary, rarely examined. They said it as a compliment. I accepted it as one. Back then, I didn't know how thin the line was between being appreciated and being assumed. People around us thought we were balanced. I was calm, they were expressive. I handled logistics, they handled charm. At dinners, they told the stories. I listened, smiled at the right moments, and filled in details only when asked. If someone needed help moving, planning, fixing, remembering, my name came up quickly. If someone asked who was emotionally expressive, ambitious, or the heart of the relationship, that wasn't me. And I didn't resent that, not at first. I believed in quiet contribution. I believed that love didn't need to be loud to be real. I believed that showing up consistently was its own language. So when I felt myself fading slightly into the background, I told myself that this was maturity, that this was what a long-term partnership looked like once the novelty wore off. What I didn't realize then was how invisibility can disguise itself as peace. Inside the marriage, my role was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. I was the one who adjusted. If plans changed, I adapted. If moods shifted, I compensated. If something was forgotten, I remembered it for both of us. I learned the emotional terrain well enough to navigate it smoothly, quietly, without asking for directions. And because I didn't complain, no one questioned the arrangement. There were moments, small, almost unnoticeable ones, where I felt a subtle absence. Decisions made without my input. assumptions about my availability, a sense that my presence was expected, but my preference was optional. But these moments were fleeting, easy to rationalize. Everyone misses things sometimes, I told myself. Everyone gets busy. After all, they were there. They came home. They shared meals. They occupied the same space beside me in bed. From the outside, nothing was missing. Yet slowly, I began to understand something I couldn't yet articulate. Presence existed without commitment. Not abandonment, something quieter than that. A kind of emotional placeholder. I was included by default, not by intention. I didn't feel unloved in an obvious way. I felt unselected. If love is a series of choices, then I was the option that never required choosing. I was already there, reliable, patient, predictable. Why reach when something is already within arm's length? I don't say this with bitterness, only accuracy. At the time, I still believed that being indispensable was a form of security, that if I made myself useful enough, steady enough, easy enough, I would eventually be chosen in a deeper way, that my quiet would be met with care, my consistency with consideration. But the truth is, the way people perceive you shapes the role you're allowed to play. And I had been perceived as someone who would remain, regardless of whether I was actively chosen or not. To them, I was the foundation. But foundations are rarely admired once the structure stands. I didn't feel invisible because I lacked presence. I felt invisible because my presence had become assumed. And the assumption is the slow erosion of intimacy. At this stage of my life, I still defend the story. If someone asked how we were, I said good without hesitation. If doubt surfaced, I pressed it down gently, like smoothing a wrinkle in fabric. I had not yet learned that ignoring something doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it quieter. This is who I was to them. Dependable, calm, always there. A constant in the background of their life. Useful, loyal, unquestioned. What I didn't know yet was how much it would cost to remain in a role where I was never truly chosen, only kept. The first small cut didn't arrive with cruelty. There was no raised voice, no sharp sentence that could be replayed and proven. That's why it stayed with me. It was ordinary enough to be dismissed, quiet enough to be forgotten by everyone except the person who felt it. It happened on a Tuesday evening. I remember that because Tuesdays were our least ceremonial days. No expectations, no performances, just routine. We had been invited to a small gathering, nothing formal. I had rearranged my schedule to make it, declined a work dinner, and rushed home to change. When I mentioned this in passing, more as a check-in than a request, they nodded without really looking at me and said, "Oh, I told them I might come alone. I wasn't sure you'd be free." The sentence landed softly, almost gently. I smiled and said, "I am free." And that should have been the end of it. But something in me paused, not because they had made plans without confirming. People do that all the time. But because of how easily my presence had been treated as optional, not worth checking, not worth clarifying, just assumed absent until proven otherwise. At the gathering, the story was told differently. Someone asked if I'd been busy lately, and my spouse laughed lightly and said, "You know Aria, always doing her own thing." It was said warmly, affectionately even. No one questioned it. I didn't either, outwardly. But inside, I felt the smallest shift, a hairline fracture. A realization that the narrative of me, independent, self-contained, always fine, was being used to justify not choosing me. I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need to be consulted for every small plan, that this was what equality looked like. I even felt a flicker of pride in being seen as flexible, undemanding. That's how these things work. The first cut rarely hurts enough to protest. Later that night, when we got home, I mentioned it lightly, not accusingly, just enough to be honest. I said, "Next time, I'd like to be asked instead of assumed." They looked surprised, not defensive, confused, as if the idea hadn't occurred to them that something had been taken, not given. "I didn't think you'd mind," they said. "You're not really sensitive about that stuff." And that was the moment, the true cut, not the plan, the perception. I had been emotionally categorized without my consent, filed under low maintenance, a compliment that quietly erased my right to consideration. I nodded. I let it go. I even reassured them. "It's fine," I said. And in a way it was. The evening continued. The marriage continued. Life continued. But something else began that night too. I began remembering, not obsessively, not dramatically, just accurately. I remembered other moments that felt similar in retrospect. decisions about holidays made before asking me, jokes at my expense that relied on my silence to land, emotional disclosures shared with others before they were shared with me. Nothing severe enough to point to, everything small enough to excuse. When I mentioned these things to friends, they brushed them off. That's just how long relationships are. At least they're not controlling. You're lucky you have freedom. And I absorbed that language. I used it on myself. I translated neglect into independence, absence into space, dismissal into trust. The world is very good at validating quiet endurance. What no one saw was the internal adjustment I began making. The way I recalibrated my expectations downward was just a little at a time. The way I stopped offering preferences was unless they were asked for directly. The way I learned to preempt disappointment was by not reaching for anything that required active choosing. This wasn't self-pity, it was self-management. I still loved them, I still showed up, but something subtle had changed in how I held myself, like placing a fragile object back on a shelf, not broken, just no longer in use. That first small cut never healed because it was never acknowledged, and because it was never acknowledged, it quietly became the template. Not for anger, for awareness. I didn't know it yet, but that moment marked the beginning of a long internal record, one that would eventually matter more than anyone realized. Once the first small cut had been absorbed, the others followed more easily, not because they were sharper, but because I had already learned how to explain them away. That's the quiet danger of early dismissal. It trains you to become your own interpreter, smoothing over meaning before it can fully register. Disrespect didn't arrive as an event. It arrived as a pattern. It looked like conversations that happened around me instead of with me, plans that were announced instead of discussed, emotional energy that was spent generously elsewhere and rationed carefully at home. None of it was dramatic enough to confront. All of it was consistent enough to feel familiar. I noticed how often I adjusted my language. I stopped saying I need and started saying it's fine if. I learned which topics invited engagement and which ones quietly ended conversations. I watched how enthusiasm dimmed when I spoke about my inner life, and how it brightened when I returned to logistics, solutions, and support. So I stayed there, in the useful zone. When my spouse talked about stress, I listened fully. When I talked about mine, they nodded while checking their phone. When they needed reassurance, I offered it without hesitation. When I needed the same, I hesitated before asking, already anticipating the response. I told myself this was emotional maturity, that I was strong enough not to require constant validation, that love didn't need symmetry to be real. That story kept me quiet. The truth is, normalization happens not because you don't notice something, but because you notice it too often. You stop reacting not out of acceptance, but out of fatigue. And fatigue can masquerade as peace if you let it. There were moments I almost spoke up, pauses where the words sat right behind my teeth. But I imagined the outcome before it happened, the confusion, the defensiveness, the unintentional minimization. You're overthinking. That wasn't my intention. Why make this a big deal? I didn't want to be the person who made things heavy. I didn't want to beg for presents. I didn't want to turn quiet omissions into loud accusations. So I internalized the work instead. I became more efficient, more self-contained. I filled my own emotional gaps with books, long walks, and careful journaling. I told myself that this independence was strength, that it made me less of a burden. What I didn't realize then was how easily self-reliance can become self-erasure. Over time, my spouse began to speak for both of us, not maliciously, habitually. We're flexible. We don't really care either way. Aria's easy. Each sentence landed softly, but together they built a version of me that no longer included my inner life. And because I didn't interrupt the narrative, it solidified. Friends admired our dynamic. You two never fight. You're so low drama, I smiled and agreed. It was true, we didn't fight. We also didn't repair. We didn't clarify. We didn't renegotiate. Silence became our default language, and I was fluent. I stayed quiet because staying felt easier than challenging the structure we'd built. I rationalized that every relationship has imbalances, that love isn't always reciprocal in the same moments, that this was a season, not a statement. But seasons change, patterns don't, unless someone interrupts them. And I wasn't interrupting anything. Instead, I adapted so well that my absence, emotional, expressive, vulnerable, went completely unnoticed. I was there in body, in function, in reliability. But the part of me that needed to be chosen, seen, prioritized, that part learned to step back. Looking back now, I understand that this was the most dangerous phase. Not the initial hurt, not the eventual awakening, but the long middle where I taught myself not to want too much. That's how you normalize disrespect. You rename it until it sounds reasonable. You absorb it until it feels expected. You survive it until you forget that survival was never meant to be the goal. At the time, I still believed I was protecting the relationship by staying quiet. I didn't yet understand that I was protecting an imbalance that required my invisibility to function. And I was very, very good at being invisible. Roles don't need to be announced to be enforced. They settle in slowly through repetition, expectation, and the quiet relief people feel when you continue to perform without resistance. By the time I realized I had been assigned one, I was already living inside it. I was the reliable one, not in the celebratory sense, no applause, no acknowledgement, but in the functional sense, the person whose consistency allowed others to relax. I handled the invisible labor of our life together, bills paid on time, schedules remembered, emotional undercurrents smoothed before they could surface. I noticed when tension entered a room and adjusted my tone to absorb it. Over time, this became my primary value. If something needed to be handled discreetly, I handled it. If something needed patience, I provided it. If someone needed space, I gave it generously. And because I did all of this without asking for recognition, it became expected rather than appreciated. I wasn't asked how I felt about plans. I was informed of them. I wasn't consulted on emotional decisions. I was looped in afterward. My agreement was assumed because my resistance had never been tested. And I understand now why that happened. When you don't assert your presence, others fill in the blanks for you. They create a version of you that fits neatly into their life. And if that version is convenient, they rarely question it. The role I played was supportive but secondary, present but peripheral, essential yet replaceable in spirit. I began to hear it in the language. You're so understanding. You don't really need much. You're strong, you'll be fine. Each phrase sounded like praise. Each one quietly excused the absence of care. There's a particular loneliness in being valued only for what you provide, not for who you are. It doesn't feel like rejection, it feels useful. And usefulness can be dangerously addictive. Because if you are useful, you are needed. And if you are needed, you can convince yourself you are loved. But being needed is not the same as being chosen. I remember one moment clearly. We were talking about a future decision, nothing urgent, just hypothetical. I offered a preference, gently, without insistence. My spouse listened, nodded, and then said, "We'll see. You're usually okay either way." They didn't mean to dismiss me. They truly believed it. And that's when I understood. My role had been so consistent that it had overwritten my individuality. My flexibility had become my identity. I wasn't angry, I was startled. I realized then that the role I occupied required my silence to remain intact. If I suddenly asked for reciprocity, it would feel like a disruption. Not because my needs were unreasonable, but because they were unexpected. That's the risk of being the easy one. The moment you stop being easy, you become inconvenient. So I continued. Not out of fear, but out of habit. I had invested so much in being stable that I didn't know who I would be without that function. Inside, though, something shifted. A quiet separation between who I was and who I was perceived to be. I began observing myself from a distance, noticing how often my own preferences went unvoiced. How rarely I was asked, not just informed. This wasn't a crisis, it was a recognition. I had been assigned a role that asked me to be reliable at the cost of being fully present, and I had accepted it because it felt safer than risking conflict, disappointment, or loss. But roles that require you to shrink are not neutral. They extract something from you over time. They teach you to measure your worth by how little you ask for. I didn't yet know how or whether I would step out of that role, but I knew with a clarity that surprised me that continuing to live inside it would slowly erase me. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that reliability without reciprocity is not a virtue. It's an imbalance. The day something shifted did not announce itself. There was no argument, no betrayal uncovered, no dramatic line crossed that forced my hand. It arrived the way most real changes do, quietly, almost invisibly, disguised as an ordinary moment that simply refused to pass through me unchanged. It was a morning like many others. Gray light through the window. Coffee is cooling on the counter. My spouse was scrolling through their phone, half listening as I spoke about something small. An idea I'd had, a possibility I was considering. I wasn't asking for permission. I wasn't asking for praise, just sharing, the way people do when they assume they're heard. They nodded absently and said, "That's nice," without looking up. 2 words, gentle, empty, and something in me went still. Not hurt, not angry, just clear. I stopped talking mid-sentence, not dramatically, naturally, as if my body had decided there was no reason to continue. They didn't notice. The conversation moved on without me, like a river flowing around a stone. I stood there holding my mug and realized something that changed everything. If I disappeared emotionally from this relationship, nothing would actually require adjustment. That was the moment, not because it meant I was unloved, but because it meant I was not actively chosen. My presence was accommodated, not engaged with. My inner world existed parallel to theirs, not intertwined. And for the first time, I didn't rush to soften that realization. I didn't explain it away. I didn't translate it into something more palatable. I let it sit in its original shape. That morning, I went for a walk alone. No music, no distractions. Just the sound of my own footsteps and the uncomfortable clarity forming in my chest. I replayed years of moments, not to accuse, but to understand. And a pattern emerged so cleanly it felt almost impersonal. I had been performing stability in exchange for proximity, and proximity had been mistaken for intimacy. What shifted that day was not my behavior, but my allegiance. Something in me quietly moved from maintaining the relationship to maintaining myself. Not in opposition, just in priority. I didn't confront them. I didn't announce a change. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance. Outwardly, nothing changed at all. Inwardly, everything did. I stopped filling in the emotional gaps automatically. I stopped translating silence into peace. I stopped assuming that my needs were too subtle to matter. Instead, I noticed how often my presence functioned as background noise, how rarely my absence, emotional or otherwise, was registered, how quickly things continued without me when I stepped back just slightly. And instead of feeling devastated, I felt grounded. There was relief in finally naming the truth without dramatizing it. Relief in understanding that the ache I'd been carrying wasn't weakness, it was information. That day, I wrote one sentence in my notebook, just one. I am here, but I am not chosen. I didn't reread it. I didn't analyze it. I just let it exist. Because once you see something clearly, you don't need to react to it immediately. Clarity doesn't demand urgency. It demands honesty. This wasn't the beginning of an exit. It was the end of confusion. And from that point on, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It became something I chose. After that morning, I didn't become colder. I became quieter in a different way. Not the quiet of endurance, but the quiet of intention. From the outside, it would have been impossible to tell the difference. Inside, the distinction was everything. Before, my silence had been reactive. A way to keep things smooth, to avoid friction, to protect the image of harmony. Now it was selective, deliberate, chosen. I stopped volunteering information that was never held with care. I stopped narrating my inner world to someone who treated it like background noise. Not out of punishment, but out of self-respect. What surprised me was how quickly this new silence was misinterpreted. My spouse didn't ask what had changed. They assumed nothing had. In fact, they seemed more relaxed. My reduced emotional output created even less resistance in the system. Things flowed more easily. Decisions were made faster. My lack of objection was read as agreement. They mistook my withdrawal for contentment. That's when I understood something quietly powerful. People who benefit from your silence rarely question it. I listened more than I spoke. I noticed how often conversations centered on their needs, their frustrations, and their ambitions. When I offered less, no one noticed the absence. They just filled the space themselves. This wasn't cruelty on their part. It was conditioning. I had trained them, unknowingly, to experience my presence as support rather than participation. And when I stopped overfunctioning, it didn't feel like a loss to them. It felt like ease. So I let it be easy. I used that space to turn inward. Not emotionally, strategically. I began observing the structure of our life together with clarity rather than attachment. Finances, responsibilities, patterns of decision-making. I noticed who relied on whom and for what. Silence gave me perspective. I also noticed how my spouse began to interpret my calm as passivity. When I didn't react, they assumed I didn't care. When I didn't push back, they assumed alignment. When I didn't ask questions, they assumed trust. In reality, I was gathering information. There is a kind of power that comes from being underestimated. When people believe you are disengaged, they stop guarding their assumptions. They speak freely. They reveal priorities without filtering them for your feelings. I never corrected them. I wasn't playing a game. I wasn't setting a trap. I was simply no longer protecting an illusion that required my constant emotional labor to survive. My silence stopped being a shield for the relationship and became a mirror. And what it reflected was revealing. They spoke about future plans as if I would naturally adapt. They made commitments assuming my availability. They expressed certainty without seeking consent. And every time I noted it, not with resentment, but with accuracy. The more I withdrew emotionally, the more visible the imbalance became. And still, no one confronted me. Silence is often mistaken for weakness because we're conditioned to believe that power announces itself. That strength raises its voice. That clarity demands explanation. But real clarity doesn't rush. It watches. I didn't feel superior. I felt steady, grounded in the knowledge that I was finally responding to reality as it was, not as I wished it to be. This phase lasted longer than anyone would expect. Weeks turned into months. Outwardly, the marriage looked unchanged. Inwardly, I was no longer negotiating my worth. I didn't yet know what I would do with what I was learning. I only knew that I would not unsee it. And that silence, chosen consciously, was no longer a liability. It was preparation. What they never noticed wasn't a single action. It was a shift in how I paid attention. When you stop performing, you gain time. When you stop explaining yourself, you gain clarity. And when you stop trying to be understood by someone who isn't listening, you begin listening differently to everything else. I didn't announce that I was paying closer attention. I didn't need to. My role had already trained everyone to expect continuity, not curiosity. So while the surface of our life remained calm and predictable, something else was happening quietly underneath. I began documenting, not in a dramatic way, not as evidence for a confrontation, but as a way to stay anchored in reality. Dates, conversations, decisions that affected both of us but were made unilaterally. Financial patterns, emotional patterns. The rhythm of who gave and who adjusted. Who followed up and who assumed. I wasn't building a case. I was building understanding. There's a difference. I also began learning things I had previously outsourced emotionally. I educated myself on financial structures I had trusted without reviewing. Not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because trust without visibility had become part of the pattern. I wanted to know what shared actually meant in practice. At the same time, I invested in myself quietly. I took courses related to my work, updated skills I'd allowed to plateau in the service of stability. I rebuilt parts of my professional identity that had been placed on pause, not sacrificed, just deferred. None of this was reactive. It was restorative. What struck me most was how invisible this preparation remained. Because I wasn't broadcasting it, it didn't register as a change. My spouse still saw the same calm presence, the same reliability, the same lack of friction. They didn't notice that I was no longer orienting my choices around keeping the peace. I was orienting them around preserving my agency. I listened carefully when they spoke about the future, not for reassurance, but for alignment. I noticed how often we meant you'll adapt, how rarely my desires appeared unprompted in those visions. And instead of correcting them, I let the pattern speak for itself. There's a particular kind of clarity that comes from watching without intervening. You stop confusing potential with behavior. You stop projecting depth where there is only habit. You stop mistaking familiarity for intention. This wasn't bitterness, it was sobriety. I also noticed how easily my steadiness allowed others to remain comfortable. Friends, family, colleagues, all of them assumed I was fine because I didn't disrupt anything, because I still showed up, because I didn't demand. No one noticed that I had stopped seeking reassurance, that I had stopped sharing doubts, that I had stopped investing emotional energy where it wasn't reciprocated. And that's the thing about preparation. It doesn't announce itself to the people who benefit from you staying the same. They continued to speak freely around me, to assume my agreement, to treat my presence as structural rather than relational. Meanwhile, I was positioning myself quietly, not against them, but for myself. I created contingencies, emotional ones, practical ones. I asked myself questions I had avoided before, not because they were frightening, but because they were inconvenient. What would my life look like if I stopped compensating? What parts of this relationship only function because I absorb the imbalance? Who am I when I am not being needed? These questions didn't demand immediate answers. They demanded honesty. And honesty, once established, is hard to dismantle. The most revealing part was this. The more I stepped back internally, the more unchanged everything else remained. My absence was not disruptive. My reduced emotional labor was not noticed. The system continued to function because it had never relied on my full presence, only my reliability. That realization didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It clarified. I understood then that preparation wasn't about leaving. It was about no longer being trapped by confusion or hope. It was about knowing with certainty what I was standing in. What they never noticed was that I was no longer orienting my life around being chosen. I was choosing myself, quietly, consistently, without spectacle. And once that begins, it doesn't reverse. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. There was no rush of adrenaline, no cinematic pause, where everything suddenly made sense. It arrived quietly, like the final piece of a picture I had already been studying for a long time. I had enough information by then, not secrets, not scandals, just a complete understanding of how things actually worked. The leverage I discovered wasn't something I took. It was something I had always held without realizing it. I saw, with unfiltered clarity, how much of our shared life relied on my emotional regulation, my logistical competence, my willingness to absorb uncertainty so others wouldn't have to. I saw how often my presence functioned as insurance, against inconvenience, against responsibility, against introspection. And I saw how little of that was reciprocal. The truth was simple and deeply unflattering to the illusion I had lived inside. The relationship was stable not because it was balanced, but because I compensated for the imbalance. That was the reveal. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt sober. I understood then that if I stopped compensating, not dramatically, not vindictively, just factually, the structure would not hold. Not because anyone was malicious, but because it had never been built to support two fully present people. It had been built around one. That knowledge changed how I moved through the world. I no longer wondered whether I was asking for too much. I no longer questioned whether my expectations were unreasonable. I no longer tried to interpret ambiguity as depth. I also didn't rush to act. There is a difference between power and urgency. Urgency belongs to people who are still trying to be chosen. Power belongs to people who already understand the terms. I kept going to work. I kept showing up socially. I kept things outwardly steady. But internally, I was no longer negotiating my worth. The most surprising part was how neutral it felt. I had imagined that clarity would come with grief, or rage, or relief so strong it would knock the air out of me. Instead, it came with stillness. I stopped hoping that things would shift on their own. I stopped interpreting small gestures as signs of change. I stopped waiting for a conversation that would suddenly realign everything. Not because I had given up, but because I had understood. The leverage wasn't legal or financial, though those pieces mattered. It was structural, emotional, relational. I knew exactly what would happen if I stepped fully out of the role I had been playing. I knew who would feel it first and who would deny it longest. I knew which comforts depended on my silence and which assumptions depended on my availability. And because I knew, I no longer needed to prove anything. I also knew something else, something just as important. Using leverage loudly would turn this into a power struggle. And power struggles always center on the wrong thing. I didn't want to dominate. I wanted to be free, so I kept the reveal private. I didn't hint at it. I didn't weaponize it. I didn't let it leak into my tone or my behavior. I held it the way you hold a compass, quietly, internally, letting it guide your steps without announcing your direction. From the outside, I was still calm, still agreeable, still easy. From the inside, I was no longer confused, and confusion is the only thing that keeps you stuck. Once you see the structure clearly, you don't need to break it to leave it. You just need to stop holding it up. That understanding didn't make me cruel, it made me precise. It allowed me to move forward without resentment, without chaos, without needing to be seen as right, because the reveal wasn't about them. It was about me finally seeing the truth, and trusting myself enough to act on it when the time came. Once you see clearly, the next step isn't action, it's a choice. That surprised me. I had always assumed that clarity would immediately demand movement, that once the truth revealed itself, I would either confront it or collapse under it. But clarity is quieter than that. It simply lays out the options and waits to see which one you're willing to live with. I stood at a decision point longer than anyone knew, not because I was afraid, but because I was thorough. I saw multiple paths in front of me, each one clean in its own way. I could speak up, finally articulate everything I had been holding, present the imbalance carefully, ask for recognition, for repair. That path offered the comfort of having tried. of being seen as fair, patient, and reasonable. I could stay, accept the role fully, lean into usefulness, and continue being the stabilizing presence that kept everything running smoothly. That path offered predictability, familiarity, the quiet approval that comes from being indispensable. Or I could choose something else. I could stop orienting my life around being understood by someone who benefited from misunderstanding me. That last option was the hardest to name because it didn't come with a script. It didn't require a conversation to begin. It didn't offer reassurance or closure up front. It was irreversible, not because it was dramatic, but because it was internal. Once you stop waiting to be chosen, you cannot go back to waiting. I examined the idea of confrontation carefully. I imagined the conversation in detail, the calm tone, the thoughtful phrasing, the hope that awareness might create change. And I realized something unsettling. Even if the conversation went perfectly, it would still require me to teach someone how to see me. And I no longer wanted to be taught into value. I also examined the idea of staying, not staying passively, but staying knowingly, accepting the terms exactly as they were. No illusions, no resentment, just quiet endurance. And I realized that staying would require a kind of self-abandonment I could no longer justify. The truth was this: the relationship didn't need to be discussed to be understood. It had already been speaking to me for years. So the decision I made was simple but not easy. I chose to stop participating in a dynamic that required my invisibility. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I didn't ask for permission or understanding. I made the decision internally, where it couldn't be negotiated away. That was the irreversible part. From that moment on, I stopped imagining futures that required my continued accommodation. I stopped measuring my words for acceptability. I stopped anchoring my sense of worth to whether or not I was chosen. I didn't leave immediately, not physically, but internally. I crossed a line that doesn't allow return. And something remarkable happened once the decision was made. I felt calm. Not relieved, not triumphant, calm. Because indecision had been more exhausting than the truth ever was. I understood then that the hardest choices don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they look like a quiet withdrawal from an arrangement that never fully included you. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It wasn't about proving a point. It was about alignment between what I knew and how I lived. And once alignment is restored, pretending becomes impossible. That was the moment the future became inevitable. Not because I forced it, but because I stopped resisting what I already knew. After the decision, there was no dramatic shift in my daily behavior. That was intentional. Movement, when done quietly, doesn't announce itself with urgency. It blends in, it looks like normalcy, and that's why it works. I began moving in silence. Not secrecy, clarity. I separated what needed to be separated without framing it as distance. I organized documents I had never questioned before. Not because I suspected betrayal, but because I wanted sovereignty. I reviewed financial structures with the same calm focus I brought to my work. Methodical, unemotional, precise. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just understanding the architecture of my own life. I made lists. Not exit plans, contingency plans. The kind you make when you no longer confuse hope with preparation. I asked questions of professionals without signaling distress. Neutral questions, hypothetical ones. I listened carefully to the answers and noted what applied to me. At the same time, I redirected energy that had once been spent on emotional maintenance. I invested it into my independence, quietly increasing my professional leverage, strengthening my networks, and reinforcing my sense of self outside the relationship. No one noticed. Why would they? I hadn't changed my tone. I hadn't withdrawn socially. I still showed up when expected, still responded calmly, still fulfilled responsibilities. From the outside, I was the same steady presence I had always been. That consistency was my cover. People assume that if you are calm, you are content. That if you are quiet, you are passive. That if you are not demanding change, you are not preparing for it. Those assumptions worked in my favor. I noticed how easily my spouse continued planning the future as if nothing had shifted. Long-term ideas, casual assumptions, statements that relied on my adaptability without confirming my consent. I didn't correct them. I let the gap between assumption and reality widen naturally, because the truth was this. The moment I stopped propping up the emotional structure, it became fragile. Not immediately, but inevitably. And I didn't need to rush that process. Time was already doing the work for me. I also noticed something else during this phase, something unexpectedly grounding. I wasn't angry. There was no secret satisfaction in moving quietly. No sense of superiority, just alignment. For the first time in a long time, my actions matched my understanding. And that alignment created a kind of peace I hadn't realized I was missing. I wasn't hiding, I was transitioning. There's a difference. Hiding is rooted in fear. Transition is rooted in readiness. I prepared emotionally as well, not by hardening, but by clarifying. I rehearsed no speeches. I composed no explanations. I simply made peace with the fact that clarity doesn't always arrive at the same time for everyone. Some people only feel lost when it's already happened. That was not my responsibility to prevent. As weeks passed, I became lighter, not outwardly, internally. Decisions felt cleaner, boundaries clearer. I no longer felt the low-level anxiety that came from living in contradiction. Still, no one noticed, because when someone has grown accustomed to you absorbing the imbalance, they don't recognize the moment you stop. They only notice when the consequences surface. And that moment hadn't arrived yet. For now, I moved in silence, with intention, with restraint, with the quiet certainty of someone who no longer needs to be chosen in order to choose themselves. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They rarely do. They arrived in confusion. Small things first. My spouse began to notice that certain comforts were no longer automatic. Tasks that had once been handled without discussion now required attention. Emotional reassurance that used to appear preemptively now arrived only when directly asked for, and sometimes not even then. At first, they assumed it was stress, work maybe, fatigue, a phase. I let them assume, because what they were feeling wasn't absence, it was exposure to responsibilities and emotional gaps I had quietly filled for years. They mentioned feeling off, like something was slightly misaligned. They couldn't name it. They just knew things didn't flow as easily as they used to. I listened, I didn't explain. Friends began to comment too, casually. "You seem quieter lately. Everything okay?" I smiled and said yes, and I meant it, more than I ever had before. What they were sensing wasn't unhappiness. It was disengagement from overfunctioning. The most telling moments were the ones where my spouse reached for certainty and didn't find it. They would make plans assuming my flexibility, only to realize I hadn't rearranged my schedule. They would expect emotional buffering after a difficult day, only to find me calm, but not compensating. I wasn't withholding, I was no longer overextending. And that distinction mattered more than anyone realized. Confusion turned into mild frustration, not directed at me, not yet. Directed at the situation, at the subtle resistance of a system that had always responded smoothly before. They didn't ask me what had changed. They asked, "Why does everything feel harder lately?" That question lingered in the space between us, unanswered. I watched carefully, not with detachment, but with accuracy. I noticed how discomfort was externalized rather than examined. How the loss of ease was treated as an inconvenience, not a signal. That told me everything I needed to know. The relationship had relied on my unspoken labor so completely that its absence felt like a malfunction, not feedback. I didn't rush to translate that for them. This phase was uncomfortable, but it was also honest. For the first time, everyone was feeling the true cost of the imbalance, not as an accusation, but as an experience. And experiences teach what explanations never can. My spouse began to express uncertainty, not about us, but about themselves, about why they felt unsettled, about why reassurance didn't come as easily as it used to. They searched for the feeling they had lost without recognizing what had been providing it. And still, no one named the truth. That's the thing about consequences. They don't announce themselves as lessons. They arrive as disoriented, as the quiet panic of realizing something essential has shifted without your consent. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved, because what they were experiencing was not punishment. It was reality, unfiltered, unbuffered, no longer softened by my constant adjustment. The relationship hadn't changed. Only my participation in maintaining its imbalance had. And that difference was finally becoming impossible to ignore. By the time they realized something was wrong, they were already behind the truth. The first real shift came not as anger, but as urgency. A sudden attentiveness that hadn't existed before. Questions framed as concern. Small gestures offered with an unfamiliar hesitancy, as if they were testing whether something fragile could still be reached. "Are we okay?" they asked one evening carefully. It wasn't the question itself that mattered. It was the timing. I looked at them and understood, with a calm certainty that surprised me, that this question was not curiosity, it was a reaction. Not a desire to understand me, but a response to discomfort. They had begun to feel the absence of something they had never learned to name. They tried to fix it the way people often do when consequences arrive without context, by adjusting behavior without examining patterns, by offering presence without commitment, by restoring comfort rather than addressing imbalance. There were more check-ins, more "how was your day?" more attempts at closeness that felt slightly out of sync, like reaching for someone who had already stepped back internally. I didn't reject them. I didn't criticize the effort. I simply didn't lean forward to meet it, because by then I knew something they didn't. This wasn't about effort. It was about timing. You cannot retrofit intention after years of assumption. They asked what they could do. I noticed how the question was framed. Not, "What have I missed?" but "What do you need now?" As if the past were irrelevant, as if care could be applied only at the point of discomfort. I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't offer a list. I didn't reopen negotiations. I didn't ask for proof, because what I needed had already been absent long enough to change me. Confusion followed. They couldn't understand why their attempts weren't landing. Why his reassurance felt insufficient? Why did the familiar rhythm not return? I watched them cycle through emotions, concern, defensiveness, regret, hope, without fully touching the center of it. They were responding to the symptoms, not the cause. And the cause was this: I had stopped waiting. When someone spends years being chosen by default, they don't realize the gravity of choosing intentionally until default is no longer available. They told me they hadn't known, that they assumed I was fine, that they thought silence meant stability. And I believed them. That was the tragedy of it. No one had acted with malice. No one had set out to harm. The damage was cumulative, not cruel. But harm doesn't require intent to be real. They asked if we could work on it, if things could be reset, if I could tell them what I wanted so they could finally do it right. And in that moment, I understood something quietly devastating. If I stayed now, it would only be because they were afraid of losing me, not because they had learned how to choose me. Fear can motivate change, but it cannot replace presence. I didn't say that out loud. I didn't need to. I could see the panic behind their questions, the dawning realization that the structure they relied on was unstable without my invisible support, that the relationship they thought was solid was only solid because I had been holding it up. And once you see yourself clearly in that role, you cannot return to it. It was already too late, not because they hadn't tried, but because the trying came after the truth had settled. Timing matters in love. Attention offered too late doesn't heal neglect. It only highlights it. I felt sadness then, not sharp, not overwhelming, just a clean sadness, for what we had been, for what we had mistaken for enough. They wanted reassurance that things could go back to normal. I wanted assurance that I would never again disappear inside a relationship. Those two desires could not coexist. And so without drama, without accusation, without raising my voice, I knew completely that nothing could be reversed. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was nothing like people imagine. There was no shouting, no lists of grievances, no demand for accountability delivered with trembling hands. It was quiet, almost gentle. We sat across from each other at the same table we had shared for years. The familiarity of the setting made the moment feel strangely ordinary, as if this conversation could have happened at any time. And that, in a way, was the point. They spoke first. Carefully, apologetically, they said they hadn't realized how far things had drifted, that they had taken my steadiness for granted, that they wanted to do better, be more present, more attentive, more intentional. I listened fully. I didn't interrupt. I didn't correct their framing. I didn't argue with their version of events. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to be understood. When they finished, they waited, expectant, hopeful. And I realized something then. This was the moment they believed everything could still be fixed, that enough awareness applied now might reverse years of imbalance. I spoke calmly. I told them that I believed they hadn't intended to hurt me, that I didn't see them as a villain, that I understood how patterns formed quietly, without anyone deciding them consciously. Then I told them the truth. I said that I had spent a long time being present without being chosen, that my silence had been mistaken for consent, that my reliability had replaced reciprocity. I didn't accuse, I described. I told them that I had stopped sharing not because I had nothing to say, but because there was nowhere for it to land, that I had learned to meet myself where the relationship would not. They tried to respond, to explain, to promise. I held up a hand, not to silence them, but to pause the momentum. I said gently that this wasn't a negotiation. That sentence changed everything. I explained that by the time awareness arrived, something in me had already shifted. that I no longer wanted to rebuild something that required me to disappear in order to function. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize the pain. I didn't ask them to agree. I simply stated where I was. They asked if there was anything they could do, and I answered honestly, not now. That wasn't punishment, it was true. They looked stunned not by cruelty, but by finality, by the realization that calm can be more decisive than anger. I told them that I didn't regret the relationship, that it had taught me what it meant to be steady, and what it cost to be unseen, that I was grateful for what had been real and clear about what could not continue. There was no counter-argument to that. We sat in silence afterward, not awkward, not tense, just heavy with understanding. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with recognition. And recognition, once fully arrived at, doesn't require volume. It requires acceptance. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was then. That's important to say. I didn't become harder. I didn't become colder. I didn't abandon my capacity for patience or care. What changed was not my nature, but my alignment with it. I am still calm, still thoughtful, still inclined toward listening before speaking. But I no longer confuse these traits with obligations. They are choices now, not reflexes. After the confrontation, life didn't immediately feel lighter. It felt quieter in a different way. Not the quiet of suppression, but the quiet that follows truth being spoken clearly, without ornament. I began to notice myself again, not as a function, not as support, not as the steady background presence, but as a person with preferences that didn't need justification, desires that didn't need to be minimized, boundaries that didn't require explanation to be valid. I noticed how much energy I had been spending translating myself into something easier to live with, and how much of that energy returned to me once I stopped. There was grief, of course, but it wasn't sharp, it was honest. Grief for the version of myself who believed that being chosen would eventually happen if she were patient enough. Grief for the years spent mistaking endurance for love. But there was no bitterness. Bitterness requires the belief that something was stolen from you. What I learned is that I had been offering something freely without checking whether it was being received with care. That realization doesn't breed resentment. It breeds responsibility. I take responsibility now for how I show up, for where I invest, for what I allow to remain ambiguous. I don't wait for someone to notice my absence before I notice it myself. My sense of dominance, if that word even applies, comes not from control, but from self-trust, from knowing that I can walk away from what diminishes me without needing to justify the decision. I don't chase intensity. I value intention. I don't confuse attention with commitment, and I no longer stay in places where my presence is assumed rather than chosen. People sometimes ask if I regret not speaking up sooner. I don't. I spoke when I was ready to hear myself clearly. Anything earlier would have been negotiation, not truth. Now, when I enter relationships, of any kind, I pay attention to how my presence is met, not with suspicion, but with awareness. I notice whether care shows up without being prompted, whether curiosity flows both ways, whether silence feels safe or heavy. I don't perform stability anymore. I embody it. And stability, real stability, doesn't require you to disappear. This is who I am now, someone who knows that quiet does not mean small, and calm does not mean compliant. Someone who understands that being chosen begins with choosing yourself, consistently, without drama, without apology. There's a lesson in this story, but it isn't sharp-edged. It doesn't point fingers or assign blame. It doesn't tell you to leave or stay or fight harder or soften more. It simply asks you to pay attention. What I learned, slowly, quietly, is that love is not measured by how long you endure, but by how often you are chosen when choosing requires intention. Proximity is easy, habit is easy, presence is easy, commitment is not. When presence exists without commitment, something essential goes missing, not all at once, but gradually. And because it's gradual, we adapt, we reinterpret, we normalize. Until one day, we realize we've been standing in the same place for years, waiting for something that was never going to arrive on its own. This isn't a story about someone doing something wrong. It's a story about two people participating in a dynamic that benefited from silence and assumption. One of us learned to live comfortably inside it. The other learned to disappear. And disappearing, even quietly, has a cost. The moral here is not speak up sooner or never be patient. Patience has its place. Silence can be wise. Endurance can be meaningful, but only when they are chosen, not when they are required to keep something intact. The moment you realize you are being valued for how little you ask for, rather than who you are. That realization is not an accusation, it's information. And information, when respected, gives you back your agency. You don't need to explode to reclaim yourself. You don't need to expose, humiliate, or dominate. Sometimes, the most powerful act is simply stepping out of a role that required your invisibility. Quiet dominance is not about winning. It's about alignment, about living in a way that no longer contradicts what you know to be true. If you're listening to this and feeling unsettled, not because of the details, but because of the recognition, I want you to know something important. Awareness is not a failure. It's the beginning of honesty. You are not weak for staying as long as you did. You are not cruel for leaving when you finally understand. And you are not demanding, but wanting to be chosen with intention. So I'll end with this, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not advice, not conclusions, just reflection. Have you ever been fully present in a relationship where commitment quietly never chose you back? And if so, what did it take for you to finally see it clearly? That's all.